within the United States, to be technical, and the government sort of reassesses the idea of entitlements, right? Well, are they actually entitled? They being the Japanese, right? Japanese Americans, hyphenated, of course, not just Americans, but Japanese Americans, right? Are they actually entitled to citizenship? No, they're not. So that this idea of entitlement becomes very, very vague conceptually and very vague legally, right? Because insofar as you are entitled, someone is the benefactor of the entitlement. And the point is, it seems, at least historically speaking, very whimsical. Another example, more close to home, is the slave trade. Right? I've done a lecture series on race theory. Well, if we are saying that all human beings have freedom inherently, but based on sort of conceptual and ideological construction, we created an argument wherein we can rob a population of their freedom, and we use this to legitimize their enslavement. Well, how can we talk about entitlements, right? You can't really talk about entitlements if we've said that people are free inherently, but then used logic to rob people of the things that, no, it's a bit of, I'm not just going to present the information as though it were fail-safe. That would be bad pedagogy on my part. Obviously, human rights are a good thing, but the thing that you need to do is, one, you need to have a general understanding of the information. But you also need to ask yourself, what do we mean by entitlements, right? When someone evokes entitlements, what is it exactly that we're referring to? And how do we implement, right? How do we codify? How do we legitimize these entitlements, right? Because anytime we talk about rights, we're talking about duties and obligations to respect those rights. So how does this unfold? Specifically, given the fact that there have been entitlements that have, on whim, been removed from an entire population of people. The example that I gave was the internment of Japanese Americans after the World War. Okay, so very, very important there. All right, next bit are the 5 postulates in defining human rights. And did I? Yeah, 5 postulates. Five postulates in defining human rights. Obviously, I mean, this has been, 2 hours of a lecture just talking about the preconditions of human rights, right? I haven't really got into a discussion yet, but it's already a very detailed account. And I want it to be more detailed, which is why I said I'm going to do this first series, and then I know for a fact I'm going to do another sort of much, much deeper. I want to go a lot deeper with some concepts, and I might even come back to sections that I've already addressed on a deeper level, maybe 3-4 months from now. But we're talking about the postulates, right? We're talking about, again, the preconditions, the concepts, the requisite notions and logic that we need to have in order to make sense of human rights globally. So the first is a representation of individual and group demands, right? Representation of individual and group. Representation of individual and group demands. First, for respect. Respect, value, and tolerance. Oops, A, and C, right? Respect, value, and tolerance. The idea of tolerance needs to be fleshed out a bit. I've watched a little bit too much Zizek, so my interpretation of tolerance is biased. I have a Zizekian sort of interpretation of tolerance, which isn't sort of the idea of accept people for who they are. But I'm not going to get into that now. So for me personally as a philosopher, the idea of tolerance is a bit ambiguous here. but I'm not going to get into a philosophical debate. Just understand tolerance the way you normally understand tolerance, right? So, so some of the postulates is that we have to recognize individual and group respect, right? We have to recognize their systems of beliefs and values. We have to have a tolerance for things specifically that are different from us, but we have to have a tolerance for things that we actually don't like, right? This goes back to FDR's freedom to speak in the way that we want, right? It's precisely in that sense that I can say something that might offend you, but I have that right to say that, provided X, Y, Z. Okay. Claims against impediments to such values, right? We need to make sure that, insofar as we're talking about rights, that the values that individuals have, if you have a right to that, as I said before, if subject A, subject M, agent M, has a right to X, then someone has a corresponding duty not to prevent that individual from X, right? So that's the next, that impediment is my obligation from someone's corresponding right. I hope that makes sense, right? An impediment would be me preventing you from attaining X. If you have a right to X, I have an obligation not to prevent you from gaining X. If I prevent you, if I serve as an obstruction, if I serve as a barrier, if I serve as an impediment to your right to X, then I am challenging, threatening your right, and thus, conflict arises. All right, C, and I don't need to write it up, but this is just a quote. C, standards for judging the legitimacy of laws and traditions, right? If we're going to talk about human rights, we need to have standards for judging the legitimacy of laws and traditions, right? Insofar, given positive rights, sort of in this utility sense, in this conventional sense, insofar as individuals conceptually opt into a social contract, then they are bound by the respective codified laws within that sort of jurisdiction. However, we have to make sure that the laws within that particular jurisdiction facilitate and safeguard the protection of the population. So, for example, in a genocidal state, where the state has willfully targeted portions of the population for extermination, well, you haven't properly constructed a standard that respects and values and tolerates others for who and what it is that they are and they believe, right? And this is where the idea of human rights really gets rolling, right? It's not just this conceptual right that you have. We're not just talking about theory in an abstract sense, or equality in an abstract sense, or liberty in an abstract sense. We're saying that it is precisely because I have these preconditioned, not even preconditioned, it's precisely because I have these liberties, if you will. I'm not trying to sound like a libertarian here, but it's precisely because I have these liberties that the state and others needs to respect my right to sort of self-determination, etc. Okay. 2. Human rights pertain to fundamental claims and goods, right? Human rights pertains to claims, and I'll talk about this in a second. First is needs versus wants. In a capitalist society, this is getting a little vague, right? Needs versus wants, and not knocking capitalism, but a lot, of all of the commentary that has gone around with respect to Britain being on fire and the revolt in Britain, as distinct from sort of Arab Spring revolt, Britain's revolt as one of the most interesting commentaries I heard wasn't about race relations or political oppression or anything. It was just that it was a viable excuse to satisfy our sort of capitalist desires for stuff. Hey, let's go riot and get a whole bunch of free stuff, right? The relationship between needs and wants becomes gray, right? Especially when we're talking about the state's obligation to protect others, right? If a group of and this is my interpretation, obviously is biased, but if a group of people decide that, hey, I just want to go, grab 20-inch televisions and,